Welcome back to week 4 of the I Am series. I hope this series has served to remind you in a very real way who Jesus is and what his place is in our world today. My prayer for all of us through this truly unprecedented time in my life is that we can move and rest in the hope that Jesus offers to the world. The story we're going to be working through tonight is in direct continuation of the story we worked through last week, and it's one that serves as a turning point in John's gospel. There's kind of a bunch of stuff that goes on in the beginning where Jesus is doing all these miracles and he's performing all these signs, showing people that he's God. This is the turning point. From here on, that kind of style is not going to be what follows after. We're going to see tonight some of the rawest expression of emotion in all of the scriptures, and it comes at a point where there is significant hurt in the hearts of individuals whom Jesus is very, very close with. And through all of that, Jesus performs his most important miracle, and he does so knowing what the results of the actions are going to be for him. And we're in chapter 11 tonight, but it's worth looking back at the end of chapter 10 to get a fuller perspective of the cost of what's coming for Jesus. And looking back to last week, we talked about Jesus as the good shepherd and how that meant that the Pharisees were the false shepherds. We talked about how they again picked up their stones and accused him of blasphemy for claiming that he was God himself. And we talked about how Jesus again escaped their grasps. And that's where we left off. But chapter 10 ends with Jesus going to a land where he was welcomed. And starting in verse 40, it reads, "Then Jesus went back across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing in the early days. And there he stayed, and many people came to him. And they said, 'Though John never performed a sign, all that John said about this man was true.' And in that place many believed in Jesus." At the end of this chapter, Jesus is in a comfortable place amongst people who understand who he is and love him for that. People who have mostly supported him from the very beginning, who believed he was the Messiah because they believed John the Baptist and they saw that Jesus was the one that John was talking about. This is a good place for Jesus and the disciples. The people want him there, and he wants to be there with the people. And so he stays there for a while. But chapter 11 changes things. And this chapter begins with Jesus getting news that a close friend of his is dying, a man named Lazarus. And the news comes from a messenger sent by Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha. And Mary will later anoint Jesus, a process that signifies his kingship. And that kind of shows the close proximity, the close relationship that Jesus had with these three siblings. And together, these three are really some of Jesus' closest friends outside of the disciples themselves. And Jesus tells the messenger that Lazarus' sickness would not end in death, but that all of this was happening to God's glory and so that Christ himself would be glorified. And then he does something odd. In verse 6, it tells us he waited 2 more days and then told the disciples, "Let's go to Judea," after 2 days of waiting. So now the disciples are pretty confused by this. For starters, they were just in Jerusalem before coming across the Jordan again. And why did they leave? Oh yeah, they were going to be killed if they stayed where they were. But here Jesus is telling them, hey, it's time to go back again. So naturally, they kind of question this course of action, but Jesus continues on to tell them essentially that they don't have to be afraid because Jesus is going to be there with them. And Jesus tells them Lazarus has fallen asleep. And again, they're confused about that. So Jesus tells them straight up, Lazarus is dead. And they finally get it. And they leave with him. After Thomas says this in verse 16, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." In verse 17, they arrive in Bethany, about 2 miles from Jerusalem, and Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Now I want to stop here before going on and kind of point out some of the subtle but important details that might go unnoticed at first glance. The first is the timeline. Jesus didn't go far away across the Jordan. He just went right across to the other side of the river. And that means that the messenger probably only took a day or so to find Jesus. And they went 2 days where, they're waiting around, and then they left and probably took a day or so walking back. So that's 4 days right there. What that tells us is that it's pretty likely that Lazarus died the day the messenger was sent out. And Jesus knew that he had died. And based on this information, I believe it's plausible to think that Jesus spent the 2 days that they were waiting in prayer, and he was asking God to use Lazarus' death for his glory. And when the time came, he was ready because he knew what God was going to do. The other side of that is Jesus also praying for his own death and resurrection, the ultimate glorification that God had in store. The second detail is that line from Thomas. Thomas didn't realize it at the time, and neither did anyone else outside of maybe Jesus himself, but his line was actually prophetic. He and most of the disciples would eventually die for Christ. And from John's perspective, when he's writing this letter, this gospel story, some of those deaths had even already occurred. And he most likely, in a moment of revelation, realized the reality of Thomas's command when he was writing down the story of the life that he lived with and for Jesus. And this isn't the only small bit of prophecy in this chapter. So let's keep going here. As we're told in verse 18, many Jews from Jerusalem came to mourn with Martha and Mary. And this is a very common practice in many parts of the world, even up to today. It's more than just a funeral, as we typically have in the Western world. These funerals can and do frequently last for days. And there is a very, very deep grief expressed not only by close relatives, but also distant relatives and friends of the family. What we would consider very deep and brutal signs of extreme grief, like wailing and body tremors and things like that at the loss, are actually commonplace in a lot of the world, even to this point. And it's important to note that as the story continues on, we need to be paying attention to those kind of emotional moments. Martha is the first to come out and meet Jesus, and she has this conversation with Jesus starting in verse 21. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." So Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." Now, Martha displays here what should be considered a very solid belief in who Christ was up to this point. She's expressing faith that Jesus is the Messiah, that the Jews had been expecting for generations. Now, that belief may be a little bit flawed in the conclusions that she's been taught to draw on, but it's faith nonetheless, and it's more faith than most of Jesus' followers to this point had expressed in him. Now, one of the flaws here in this thinking is the traditional Jewish idea that all Jews would be resurrected in the last day. That is really what Christ is talking about here. He makes that clear with arguably the most important of all the I am these statements: I am the resurrection and the life. He's explaining that the gift of eternal life is found in him alone. It's not something that's given by him. He's it. Christ is resurrection and the life, and he has been from the very beginning of creation and before. To quote N.T. Wright's commentary on this section, Jesus is challenging her, urging her to exchange her if only for an if Jesus. If Jesus is who she is coming to believe he is, if Jesus is the Messiah, the one who was promised by the prophets, the one who was to come into the world, if he is God's own Son, the one whom the living God is strangely and newly present, if he is resurrection in person, life come to life, if you have an if only in your heart right now, put yourself in Martha's shoes. Run off to meet Jesus. Tell him the problem. Ask him why he didn't come sooner, why he allowed the awful thing to happen, and then be prepared for a surprising response. God will step into your world and show you, through the grief and mess, good news with hope and possibilities. The starting point for that result is faith, and Martha shows that here. I've had this kind of intense, faith-filled encounter with God. When my grandmother on my dad's side passed away, it caused me great pain because our family history and the division on that side of my family caused me to never get to have a real relationship with my grandmother. And when my aunts asked me to do her funeral, I said yes, but I didn't realize the level of personal pain that I was going to be putting myself through. And as I started writing the funeral, and after having spent some time talking to my relatives, whom I had basically never met before, I started to experience that pain. And as I'm writing, I'm asking God why he made me the one who had to have this burden of reconciliation put onto my shoulders. And he illuminated the generational sins of my family to me. For several generations, there was this accepted animosity and division amongst siblings in our family. And I was there, put in that place to use my voice to call those sins to the table and let God start the healing process. It was tough and painful for me, but God showed me the good news. And I'm curious to know if any of you had an experience like that where you went to Christ with extreme grief and through your tears, he showed you good news. For me, it was, if Jesus is a reconciler, can he reconcile my family's burdens? And if you've had an experience like that, I'd love to hear about it in the comment section or privately if you want to DM me or meet with me in person. Continuing on here, at the end of this quick conversation, Martha goes and grabs Mary, and she approaches Jesus with the same charge, basically, as Martha has in verse 32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." Now, this is a really powerful scene in John's gospel for several reasons. The very observable on the surface emotions that Jesus expresses alongside the others shows his humanity to us. He is a fully human being. And when his friends are weeping, he feels their pain in the same very raw and real way we do with our own friends. He feels it, and he expresses that. I've been in Jesus' place here with my friends when they've lost loved ones. And this passage rightfully brings us comfort in those times. But that's not all that Jesus is expressing grief about. When it says Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled, it isn't exclusively the emotion of sadness that's conveyed with those words. It's also anger. It's anger on his part at death and sin itself as a result of the evil that's in our world. Not only is Jesus mourning alongside his friends at their pain and their loss here, but his pain and sorrow is also because of his mourning with all of creation. That this evil, that this death and this sin exists in the world. But he knows he's come to put a stop to it. Continuing on in verse 37 through 43 here. But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" And Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days." And then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" And so they took away the stone. And then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Now, Jesus once again expresses that extreme emotion here. And it's important that we have that image of him in our minds as this scene starts to unfold, because it shows how he feels about death itself and the extent that he's willing to go to get rid of it on our behalf. The unanswered question here is worth keying in on. What about the smell? It's been 4 days in hot, humid Judea. This is the general time frame that people give before decomposition has started to set in. But that's not the case here. This again points to Jesus' days of prayer. He thanks his Father in verse 41 because when that stone is rolled away, he knows Lazarus is alive. And he's on the inside, waiting for Jesus' command. And in the midst of all the emotion and turmoil of this time period for all of these people, the Father is still listening to the Son, and he's still acting on his prayers. That's the very relationship that Christ calls us to have. And he opened up that relationship by fulfilling what this miracle foreshadowed in his own life. Remember, from the beginning of this trip, Christ himself and all the disciples knew what was at stake if they returned to Bethany. The political leaders in Israel knew what was at stake if a man like Christ was allowed to live and come to power, or so they thought. And they still, after all the signs, really didn't understand what the kingdom of God was like. But that didn't stop them from fearing being utterly destroyed by Rome, and if a messianic figure was to lead an army in revolt against Roman rule. Verse 49 expresses the full reality of this situation without the speaker realizing it. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up. "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. And not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. And so from that day on, they plotted to take his life. Now that's that second prophecy, that just like Thomas had earlier that we talked about. Caiaphas didn't know it, but Jesus was dying for all people. Under him, all people would be united and brought back to the Father. And amongst the sadness and all the if-onlys that all of these people were having, Jesus' followers, the onlookers, and the Pharisees alike, were asking God about these things. Jesus used Lazarus to show the whole world what he was offering, the gift of eternal life, Jesus Christ. And as we come back together next week, we'll wrap up this series. We'll be working through a large section of John that all centered around the last words that Jesus has for his disciples before his arrest and subsequent crucifixion. And I'm very excited to share with you in this series one more time. But before we go, I want you to think about those if-onlys that Martha had. And I want you to take your own if-onlys and turn them into if Jesus. I'll see you all next week.